For our last couple videos for this unit, we're going to be getting into the different organisms and how we can categorize them. Specifically, we'll be looking at plants, fungi, and animals. So why do we care? Well, all organisms, no matter how big, small, important, or seemingly insignificant they are our evolutionary cousins, and they all belong on Earth. We're going to see the interconnectedness between all these different organisms and really find some of the importance of each of these different groups. So we're going to start with the smallest, and for this video we're going to focus on those who are photosynthetic. So we're looking at the cyanobacteria, which are bacteria that have their own chlorophyll, and so they can go through the process of photosynthesis. So cyanobacteria and blue-green algae are both organisms that photosynthesize. They closely resemble the first photosynthetic organisms on Earth that were around about 3 billion years ago. Because they're going through photosynthesis, we are using carbon dioxide gas to fuel the production of sugars and then release water or oxygen into the atmosphere. So these photosynthetic organisms were responsible for the oxygen revolution. This was a period of time on Earth when oxygen became so abundant that it almost suffocated all the other life forms to which oxygen was toxic. It's important to note that our atmosphere has changed many times throughout the millennia. Prior to all of this, the atmosphere was very oxygen poor and would not support organisms like ourselves. And it's really due to things like cyanobacteria and the plants that we're able to exist at all. Getting into the plants, these are where we get into more complicated eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms. They're multicellular, I already mentioned they're eukaryotic, and they're sessile. Sessile meaning that they are stationary, they cannot move. And they are terrestrial, meaning we are on land. So the bacteria, the cyanobacteria, the algae that we were looking at on the previous slide was generally aquatic, whereas the plants were now on land. They are autotrophs, just like the cyanobacteria, meaning they produce their own food for energy using that chlorophyll found in their chloroplasts. But given the fact that they cannot move on their own, they have some challenges in getting light and water and finding a mate, because plants go through sexual reproduction. And so there are various different ways that plants will step up to these challenges, including how they grow, how they pair with different types of bacteria to help with their roots, and then their very unique, very interesting relationships they have with pollinators. But let's start with the very earliest of plants, which were non-vascular, meaning there was no tissue that would conduct or move water and nutrients throughout the plant. And so these guys had to stay really small, and they had to stay very close to water. So we're looking at things like mosses. Mosses are a good example of non-vascular plants in that they don't have any of those tissues, there's no true roots, there's no true leaves, they're stuck being very small, and they have to be in a generally moist environment. Over time, we'll see the evolutionary leaps and bounds that we make, the adaptations we find that overcome these challenges of obtaining light, water, and sexual reproduction. So this is the time frame we're looking at. We've just introduced the non-vascular plants, which are going to be things like the mosses. And then as we move through time, we'll get to the vascular seedless plants, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. So there are some ancestral protist, some eukaryotic photosynthetic organism that then diverged and created things like mosses, and diverged again to become things like the vascular seedless plants. So if we look at the big steps, the big evolutionary steps plants have made, non-vascular plants are finally terrestrial. We've made the leap from water to land, which it doesn't seem like much because we still have to stay really close to moist. We have to be in moist environments. We have to stay really small, but it's still a pretty big leap. From there, the next evolutionary leap is, do we have vascular tissue? And so things like ferns are a good example of this, where we now have true stems and leaves. We can get much larger because we have the tissues that will allow us to move things like water and nutrients around. So you don't have to stay very, very close to the ground anymore. Cells at the very, very end of a long frond can now get the water and nutrients they need from the roots. But we do not actually have seeds at this point. At this point, we're still producing spores to reproduce. Then we branch off and we have the production of seeds, and that's where we get into the group called the gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are things like the conifers, pine trees. It's around Christmas time, at least at the time of recording for this, so you probably have one of these guys set up in your house possibly. And with the gymnosperms, these plants now can produce actual seeds. And these seeds can be moved around by various organisms for the plant. These guys are very, very hardy, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. Very, very hardy plants. And then the last evolutionary leap we make is the production of fruit and flowers. And this is where we're going and taking that seed and we're covering it. So the gymnosperms have what we can call like a naked seed, and the angiosperms have these beautiful flowers and fruit that cover the seed and will help nourish that seed once it starts to grow, or provide some sort of incentive for a pollinator to come by, eat that fruit, and then deposit the seeds in a further spot. So we're looking at millions of years for this to happen. We're seeing the first land plants about 475 million years ago, and now we're seeing the angiosperms today, which they're the newest of the plants. They're also one of the most dominant, with over half or about 250,000 species. So plants have an ancestor that would be algae. So we look at those cyanobacteria and those algae, and that was the ancestors of plants. We made the move from water to land, but the biggest challenge was gravity and dehydration. So how do we get access to light? We have to grow upward. We have to fight against gravity to get upward, to get towards the light. And we're no longer in a wet environment, or at least an aquatic environment, and so there's a risk of losing water. And so the biggest, or the first major evolutionary development was the cuticle, which was a waxy coating that prevented water loss. And so this is why now we can leave the water and be on land. And the bryophytes, which are the mosses, they're these non-vascular plants that, again, really small. They need to have contact with water, but they don't need to actually be fully inundated underwater. So this is a big, it doesn't seem like it, but it's a really big step. The bryophytes, or the mosses, reproduce using spores. And these were just single cells that had some genetic material and a few proteins. And the bryophytes were really useful because they could provide ground cover, and they also prevent soil erosion. Bryophytes are still around today. If you've ever seen mosses along the ground, they actually do prevent the soil from getting washed away in things like rain. So let's go ahead and look at these guys. So mosses, also things like hornwort and liverwort, but again, we see that these are very, very tiny. If you look at moss very much up close, you see how small the structures are. Now, because we don't have vascular tissue, we have to use diffusion to get water and nutrients around, and so that's why we're limited in size. We can't really diffuse something across, a meter-long stem. We release haploid spores that will grow and produce gametes, and the life cycle with multicellular haploid and diploid phases. So we have an interesting kind of life cycle where we can be multicellular at both the haploid and the diploid phases. That's different from like humans, where we are diploid at the multicellular stage, but we are single-celled as haploid cells. And so like I said, we're looking at mosses, which make up the bulk of the group, liverworts and hornworts. The next evolutionary development that we make in plants is vascular tissue. These are internal tubes made of things like xylem and phloem that will conduct water or move water and nutrients around the plant. This is going to allow the plants to get much larger in size. And so when we're looking at the vascular seedless plants, we're looking at things like ferns. And now we have roots that can reach water underground. And so we don't necessarily need so much water available in the given environment. We still want moisture, but we don't need to be extremely damp. The third major evolutionary development in plants were seeds. We've moved away from spores and now we have seeds. These are multicellular structures that have a plant embryo, water and nutrients encased in a protective covering. That's why seeds can be so nutrient dense, is that they have all these nutrients packed away for a developing plant embryo to use, since the seed itself, the plant embryo, cannot photosynthesize yet. Since we don't actually have leaves yet, we can't go through photosynthesis, and so we basically have a plant embryo surrounded by what basically will keep that embryo alive until it can finally grow the structures it needs to go through photosynthesis. And so we look at the vascular seedless plants. Taking a small step back, we're looking at things like ferns, including major large ones like tree ferns, hare's foot ferns, also known as like rabbit's fern, horsetail. There's a lot of different types of ferns. We now have they have its own kind of like circulatory system of vascular tissue that will move nutrients and water. We still use spores, right? And again, our life cycle is multicellular for both the haploid and diploid phases. When we're looking at the introduction of seeds, we're looking at the gymnosperms. These are going to be producing cones rather than fruit. And we also still have vascular tissue and we produce seeds. That's the new thing. Gymnosperms includes things like cycads, ginkgo, and conifers. You're probably more familiar with the conifers because that's going to be things like pine trees and whatnot. And that's probably something you're more familiar with. With the conifers, we're looking at some of the tallest and the oldest trees on the earth. So we're looking at massive, massive, massive plants. If you ever have a chance to go to California and visit things like Yosemite or Sequoia or Kings Canyon National Parks, all three are absolutely amazing. You can actually see some of these massive trees in person. The pictures, quite honestly, do not do it justice. They are absolutely huge. So take maybe a little bit of time and when you look at them and you see how big they are, you see how much carbon they lock away and how much, how that vascular tissue has allowed them to get that big. This is also one of the reasons why it's so problematic for deforestation, especially with forests like this, as well as forests like rainforests. These trees are what we call a carbon sink, meaning they're going to lock carbon away. And so it's really, really useful for us to have this where we can lock things like carbon away and pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then the fourth major evolutionary development of plants are the flowers. These are reproductive structures that are going to attract pollinators. And the angiosperms are the group called, or is a group of flowering plants. This is the most diverse group. Like I mentioned earlier, 250,000 different species of angiosperms. So a ton of different ones. They've really exploded and taken over the plant world. So let's go ahead before we get into the angiosperms anymore. Let's look at the gymnosperms. So we see things like cycads, which almost look like ferns, but they're not. Ginkgo with their fan-like leaves, which have a much more like ancient look to them. Things like the Douglas fir, which is probably more familiar for most people. These guys still have that vascular tissue, but now we're producing cones that have seeds in them when we're going and reproducing. And so we're looking at the ginkgo, which there's only one species, neophytes, cycads, and conifers, which make up the bulk of the group. But back to the angiosperms, where those flowering plants have really developed a new strategy when it comes to sexual reproduction, and that's creating a very unique relationship between the plant and the pollinator. And so they have very, very wildly different strategies for attracting pollinators. Many of these plants do have the ability to self-pollinate, meaning they don't necessarily need a mate. They can pollinate themselves, but they do when we're looking at trying to increase genetic diversity, having a mate can be very beneficial in that. All of these plants that flower produce fruits, and when we say fruits, we're probably thinking of the ones in our kitchen, things like apples, things like oranges, plums. Those are all good examples. And so fleshy fruits, which is what we would think when we think of a fruit, they're usually colorful, they're sweet, they have a lot of water in there, they're nutrients. And the reason why we're producing these fruits is that it serves as an incentive for animals to eat those fruits. Surprisingly, yes, the tree does, or the plant does want you to eat the fruit. Granted, the way that we eat our fruits probably doesn't do so much for the trees and for the bushes or plants that are flowering. But if you are something like a bear and you come across an apple tree, you're going to eat that entire apple, all the way down, including the core, where the seeds are at. And so this is the prize for the animals, that they get the nutrition of the fruit. And what they do, since they eat the whole thing, including the seeds, they're going to carry the seeds resulting from pollination. So pollination has already happened with the seeds at this point. And now we're trying to basically move these seeds somewhere else. So for pollination, we're going to have relationships with like bees or birds, even mammals, to move pollen from one flower to another so that we can fertilize the ovules so we can create seeds. And then once we do that, we create the seed, we have the fruit around the seed, and then we need to move those seeds away because the tree doesn't want all of its seeds to fall down below it, right? We want those seeds to be dispersed further away from the parent. And so with the fleshy fruit, the animal eats the entire thing, it carries the seeds as it wanders through the forest or wherever it's at, and eventually it will have to defecate. And when it does defecate, then it'll carry the seeds to those new locations and defecate somewhere along the ground and deposit those seeds on the ground along with some fresh fertilizer. Now, animals basically have kind of helped drive this selective process for fruits to be sweeter because they were choosing the sweetest fruits to eat. And so there was a push, or I guess you could say a pull, for plants to produce sweeter fruits because those are the ones that were being moved around and successfully being put in new locations. So any plants that produced less sweet fruit did not get to reproduce as well. Their seeds just fell to the ground below them. They didn't disperse, and so they were not as successful. Plants also have a lot of defense mechanisms, including both physical and chemical means. So things like different chemicals they might produce that make them toxic. They can kind of detract herbivores that maybe they taste nasty, and so they're not eaten by most things. They can also do things like, if you think of poison oak or poison ivy, they can produce things like oils like urushiol that will give you a rash, right, if you go and touch them. So they have a lot of different defense mechanisms. There's a wide variety of them to try to deter animals or different organisms from hurting the plant itself. The fruit, we want the trees or the plants want the fruit to be eaten, but they don't want the leaves or the branches to be eaten necessarily. And so a lot of plants have different mechanisms to defend themselves from the herbivory. And so let's go ahead and look at various different ones. We see things like a water lily, a cherry tree, plums, lavender, anything that has a flower is going to be included in the angiosperms. And so we still have that vascular tissue, but now we have an enclosed seed within an ovary. We're producing flowers to attract pollinators. We are producing fruits to attract organisms to basically do the moving of the seeds for us. And we're looking at 250,000 different species. Now, what are some of the strategies we can use to attract pollinators? There's a few different things that we can do, and depending on the plant, you may employ one or more of these strategies. But let's go ahead and talk about some. One is trickery. So this is common among certain things like orchids, where we actually deceive the pollinator into thinking that there is a potential mate. and instead it's the actual flower. So in this case, we see this male bee, or we see something that looks like a male bee or a female bee, and that the male bee lands on her thinking he's going to be able to mate, but instead just gets stuck with a bunch of pollen, and then he will pick up the pollen and go to other orchids. I like to kind of think of it like basically the flower is catfishing these insects. Another one is with wasps. So there's a lot of different, especially with orchids, that like to use trickery to trick the pollinator into thinking they have a potential mate available. There's also bribery. So I don't know if I would call it bribery. It's more of like I'll give you something if you do a task for me, like payment. So they will basically offer something of value to an animal, like a bee. And so something like nectar is considered a valuable thing to things like bees or hummingbirds and whatnot. They can eat it. It's very nutrient dense for them. And so they'll fly from flower to flower getting that nectar. But while they're doing that, while they're searching for that nectar, they go to the flower, they drink the nectar, they're getting covered in that pollen. And so they go to the next flower covered in pollen, they drink the nectar, they're going to leave some of that pollen behind, they're going to pick some new pollen up. And so it's kind of like just a mass transit way of moving pollen around, while basically paying the bee or hummingbird or whatever organism it is, paying them for their services. When it comes to how we attract pollinators in the first place, we use things like colors and patterns. So bright colors are usually for things that are awake during the day, things that are very visually oriented, like birds, butterflies, and bees. It's important to note that the flowers generally also include colors we cannot see ourselves, because a lot of organisms like bees can see things in ultraviolet light, and so there may be colors or patterns found on these flowers we are not even capable of seeing without false coloration. Usually though, for nocturnal things or nighttime pollinators, we're looking at white, something that's going to be bright and stand out amongst the dark sky. For flower structure, we can use different shapes of flowers to match with pollinators. We usually try to have specialized relationships with pollinators because we want to make sure that their pollinator is going to go to a flower of the same species as us. And so by specializing our structure, so creating long tubes or intricate or closed designs, we can basically guarantee that our pollinator is going to be able to go to the same species relatively soon. We also can use odors, so moths, butterflies, bees tend to go with something that's sweet. They have a good sense of smell, they're attracted to the sweet smell, and so the butterflies and bees will move towards those. But if we're using something like a fly, then we want something stinky. And so not every pollinator or not every plant smells good. There are some that smell like rotting flesh or rotting meat, and that's because the flies are attracted to that. And then if we're using pollinators like birds, then there really isn't an odor because the birds don't have a good sense of smell. And then lastly, with nectar, nectar is something that we may or may not use. It's expensive to produce, so usually it's reserved for pollinators that have a high energy need, so butterflies, bees, birds. So the nectar is there to reward them and basically give them the energy they need to get to the next flower so they can successfully move that pollen. But if it's something like flies or beetles, then we don't necessarily produce nectar because they're not interested in it. They're not looking for that. They're looking for a place to lay eggs, or they're looking to eat other parts of the plant, including things like pollen. And then seed dispersal. Once we've gone and pollinated those, how do we get the seeds from one place to another? So we talked about using the fleshy fruit as a form of bait. The animal eats the fruit, including the seed. They go, they live their lives, and then they will defecate somewhere, and the seed will come out completely unharmed out the other end in a brand new location. But we can also use things like hitching a ride. So some seed pods have little spines or little projections that will cling to things like the fur of animals that walk by. Or we can fly or float on. So things like a dandelion with those little dandelion seeds, the little poofy balls that are on them, they will get carried away by wind. We can also be carried away by water. So maybe if it's a plant like a tree that's common near rivers or lakes, then maybe we use a water-based one where we drop the seeds into the river, they get carried down and eventually deposited somewhere along the bank. So lots of different techniques or strategies to succeed as a plant. In terms of defense mechanisms, I know this slide is a little bit funky, but there's various different things that we can do. So some of the defenses are things like anatomical structures, so thorns, spines, spikes, thick layers of bark, right? These are going to make it hard for something to attack the plant because it's going to hurt that organism that's trying to do the attacking. There's also sticky traps, so conifers exude what's called pitch, which is really, really sticky. So insects that are trying to attack the tree will then get smothered in this sticky goo, basically, and so they're stuck, they'll suffocate, and they'll die. And then also chemical compounds, so stinging nettles, they have these little hairs that have a chemical that will give you a stinging sensation. Loco weed, when it's eaten, can cause things like cattle or horses to become lethargic, so it's something that's toxic if eaten, as well as things like poison oak and poison ivy with urushiol that will cause an itchy rash. So there's tons of ways that plants can defend themselves against undue harm as well. Even though they're sitting there standing still, they are definitely not defenseless.